Late 1944, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The Allied front is advancing, but inside SHAEF the concern is no longer distance. It is alignment. Reports from the field show Patton's Third Army issuing orders at a tempo shaped by opportunity. Rapid movements designed to exploit weakness before it can harden. On the ground, the logic feels sound. Speed still promises control. From Eisenhower's vantage point, those same orders arrive with added weight. Each directive carries implications that extend beyond the sector where it will be executed. Fuel must be reassigned, air support reprioritized. Adjacent armies must adapt their own plans to accommodate movements they did not initiate. What appears tactically efficient now begins to strain the strategic framework holding the front together. No order has been disobeyed. No authority has been challenged openly. Yet Eisenhower can see that something has shifted. Patton's orders are beginning to move faster than the strategy designed to contain them. The campaign is no longer shaped solely by battlefield opportunity, but by how well those opportunities fit within a coalition system operating at its limits. Eisenhower does not question Patton's intent or competence. He questions whether the pace of execution is still aligned with the broader design of the war. Once orders begin to outpace strategy, correction becomes inevitable. What follows is not a confrontation, but a recalibration. One that will determine how the final phase of the campaign unfolds and who ultimately governs its direction. To understand how Patton's orders began to outpace Eisenhower's strategy, it is necessary to trace how speed became embedded in Allied operations during 1944. The breakout from Normandy transformed the campaign in Western Europe. Once German defenses fractured, the battlefield rewarded initiative more than deliberation. Units that moved quickly denied the enemy time to regroup, rebuild command links, or establish coherent defensive lines. Patton's Third Army was built for this environment. Its command culture emphasized rapid decision-making, aggressive exploitation, and constant forward pressure. During the pursuit across France, Patton issued orders designed to maintain momentum at all costs. German formations fell back in disorder. Resistance often collapsed before it could solidify. In this phase, speed functioned as both tactic and strategy. Eisenhower accepted and encouraged this tempo because conditions allowed it. German command structures were disintegrating. Allied supply problems existed, but success concealed them. Coordination issues mattered less when the enemy lacked the capacity to exploit gaps. The operational system bent, but it did not break. By early September 1944, that balance began to erode. The Allied advance had outrun its logistics. Fuel shortages became persistent. Ports capable of supporting sustained operations were still being secured or repaired. Rail networks lay largely unusable. Eisenhower was forced to ration success. Every rapid movement demanded resources that had to be diverted from elsewhere. At the same time, Eisenhower's responsibilities extended beyond battlefield efficiency. The Allied force was a coalition, not a single national army. British forces pursued their own operational priorities. French authorities sought to reassert sovereignty over liberated territory. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was not merely a military preference. It was a mechanism to prevent any one army from dominating the campaign politically or symbolically. Patton's orders, however, continued to reflect battlefield logic. Opportunities still appeared along his sector. German resistance remained uneven and in some places improvised. From Patton's perspective, the solution remained unchanged. Exploit weakness immediately, before it could be reinforced. Delays looked unnecessary. Restraint looked artificial. Eisenhower's strategic framework was evolving under different pressures. He saw how rapid orders from one sector required adjacent armies to adjust their own plans. Air support had to be reallocated quickly. Fuel convoys were rerouted on short notice. The system increasingly reacted to Patton's tempo rather than shaping it. The German Ardennes counteroffensive in December 1944 reinforced Eisenhower's concerns. Although ultimately defeated, the attack demonstrated how thinly held sectors and optimistic assumptions could be exploited. The lesson was not that speed was wrong, but that speed without coordination created exposure. Eisenhower emerged from the Ardennes with heightened sensitivity to operations that appeared tactically sound, but strategically brittle. By early 1945, the Allied mission had expanded again. The objective was no longer liberation, but penetration into Germany itself. Political stakes increased accordingly. Decisions about who advanced where and under what authority carried implications for occupation and post-war governance. Orders issued at the front now generated political effects far beyond their immediate tactical purpose. Patton's Third Army remained effective and aggressive. Its orders continued to generate pressure. But the environment in which those orders operated had changed. Eisenhower's strategy now had to account for sustainment, coalition balance, and political legitimacy alongside battlefield success. This was the context in which Patton's orders began to outpace Eisenhower's strategy. The issue was not insubordination or recklessness. It was structural misalignment between a command optimized for rapid exploitation and a theater strategy increasingly focused on control, endurance, and cohesion. As the campaign entered its final phase, Eisenhower faced a narrowing set of choices. Allowing orders to continue dictating tempo risked undermining the strategic framework holding the coalition together. Bringing those orders back into alignment would shape everything that followed. From Patton's perspective, issuing orders at speed was not recklessness, but discipline. His experience suggested that the German army, once pressured continuously, lost coherence faster than it could recover it. Orders that moved quickly preserved initiative. They denied the enemy time to regroup and denied hesitation a chance to spread through Allied ranks. To Patton, the battlefield still rewarded decisiveness, and orders were the mechanism that sustained it. Eisenhower's perspective was shaped by a different responsibility. As Supreme Allied Commander, he evaluated orders not by their immediate effect, but by how they interacted with the larger system. Orders issued rapidly in one sector reverberated across the front. Fuel priorities shifted. Air support was redirected. Adjacent armies adjusted their own plans to accommodate movements they had not designed. Eisenhower saw how tactical tempo could begin to dictate strategy rather than serve it. Subordinate commanders lived inside this tension. Corps and division staffs under Patton continued to prepare aggressive plans, but they increasingly encountered strategic filters. Orders were no longer assessed solely on opportunity. They were evaluated for sustainability, coordination, and political impact. Initiative remained encouraged, but it had to be framed within Eisenhower's intent. Commanders learned that speed without alignment now carried diminishing returns. Allied political leadership interpreted the pace of orders cautiously. British authorities remained alert to perceptions of imbalance within the coalition. French leaders monitored how rapid advances translated into control over liberated territory. For them, orders issued too quickly risked creating political facts on the ground that outpaced agreed frameworks. Eisenhower absorbed these concerns, understanding that political friction could undermine unity even as battlefield success accumulated. The human dimension reinforced this caution. Rapid orders pushed troops into constant interaction with civilian populations emerging from occupation. Discipline, conduct, and visibility mattered. Incidents that occurred under conditions of speed could escalate quickly, drawing attention away from military success and toward questions of authority and control. Eisenhower recognized that tempo now carried reputational risk as well as operational benefit. German command assessed Allied behavior pragmatically. When Allied orders appeared to outpace coordination, German planners searched for seams, stretched logistics, thinly held sectors, or opportunities to disrupt supply. As Allied operations became more synchronized, those opportunities diminished. German planning increasingly focused on delay rather than exploitation. These perspectives did not reflect a clash of wills, but a divergence of obligations. Patton sought to keep the enemy unbalanced. Eisenhower sought to keep the alliance intact. Subordinate commanders sought clarity. Political leaders sought legitimacy. The German command sought leverage wherever imbalance appeared. As Patton's orders continued to arrive at speed, Eisenhower recognized that the divergence could not persist indefinitely. The system would either adapt to govern that tempo, or it would be governed by it. The moment was approaching when strategy would have to reassert primacy over orders. The moment when Eisenhower moved to reassert strategic control did not arrive as a reprimand or a dramatic intervention. It emerged from a cumulative realization that Patton's orders, effective in isolation, were beginning to outrun the framework that gave them meaning. By early 1945, Eisenhower concluded that allowing tactical tempo to continue shaping outcomes by default would weaken the very system sustaining the Allied advance. The warning signs were procedural rather than emotional. Fuel allocations were increasingly reactive, redirected to support rapid thrusts that had not been synchronized with adjacent plans. Air support schedules shifted frequently to keep pace with forward movement, disrupting preparations elsewhere along the front. Staff officers noted that coordination meetings were being overtaken by events rather than guiding them. Strategy was beginning to follow orders instead of shaping them. Eisenhower understood that this inversion could not be allowed to persist. The lessons of the previous months reinforced his judgment. The September logistics crisis had demonstrated how quickly even successful advances could stall when supply collapsed. The Ardennes counteroffensive revealed how thin margins created by overconfidence could be exploited. Together, they showed that speed without governance produced exposure rather than security. His response took the form most consistent with his command style: procedural correction. Eisenhower did not cancel Patton's operations or publicly challenge his authority. Instead, he adjusted the conditions under which orders translated into action. Approval chains were clarified. Resource allocation was tightened. Operational boundaries were reinforced to ensure that advances aligned with theater-wide sequencing rather than local opportunity alone. From this point forward, Patton's orders no longer carried automatic momentum. Proposals were evaluated not only for tactical promise, but for their compatibility with logistics, coordination, and political considerations. Speed remained valuable, but it was no longer self-authorizing. Orders had to fit the strategy before they could shape it. This marked the turning point. Once Eisenhower recognized that Patton's orders had begun to outpace strategy, alternatives disappeared. He could not return to earlier latitude without risking fragmentation across the front. Nor could he single out a successful commander without damaging cohesion. The only viable course was to reassert strategic primacy through structure rather than confrontation. German command detected the change in Allied behavior. The pressure remained constant, but its character shifted. Rapid movements were now embedded within coordinated advances that reduced exposure. Opportunities created by imbalance became rarer. German planning increasingly emphasized delay rather than disruption, reflecting the growing resilience of the Allied system. At the coalition level, Eisenhower's actions stabilized expectations. British and French leaders saw confirmation that American operational tempo would not override collective strategy. Authority remained centralized and deliberate. Decisions reflected shared intent rather than individual initiative. This was the moment when orders were decisively brought back into alignment with strategy. Not through a dramatic command clash, but through the quiet enforcement of priorities that had always existed beneath the surface. Eisenhower ensured that speed served the campaign rather than defined it. From here on, the Allied advance continued under a new equilibrium. Orders still drove movement, but strategy once again governed direction. The campaign entered its final phase, shaped not by who moved fastest, but by how well action and intent were aligned. Once Eisenhower reasserted strategic control, the effects unfolded steadily rather than abruptly. Patton's Third Army continued to advance, but the relationship between orders and execution changed. Speed remained present, yet it no longer dictated priorities on its own. Orders now moved through a framework designed to preserve alignment across the front. For Third Army, the most immediate consequence was procedural. Orders that promised rapid gains were assessed against logistics, coordination, and theater-wide sequencing before resources were committed. Fuel and air support were allocated according to broader plans rather than immediate opportunity. Advances proceeded, but their scope and timing increasingly reflected collective intent. Initiative was preserved, but it operated within clearly defined limits. Eisenhower absorbed the pressure created by this recalibration. Concerns that might have been directed toward individual commanders were instead handled at SHAEF level. By centralizing responsibility, Eisenhower protected unity within the coalition and prevented operational tempo from becoming a political liability. Decisions appeared deliberate and controlled rather than reactive to events at the front. Logistical stability improved as a result. Supply lines were no longer forced to chase rapid exploitation. Fuel shortages remained a constraint, but they became predictable rather than disruptive. Air support schedules stabilized. Operations were less likely to stall due to overextension, even when some opportunities were deliberately passed over. Across the coalition, confidence increased. British and French leaders saw confirmation that American operational tempo would not override agreed strategy. Planning for occupation and post-war administration advanced with fewer surprises. The appearance of balance mattered as much as the reality, and Eisenhower's control reinforced both. German command experienced the consequences indirectly. Allied pressure remained constant, but vulnerabilities created by imbalance diminished. Attempts to exploit stretched sectors or logistical seams produced fewer results. German defensive planning increasingly focused on delaying actions rather than disruptive counterblows, reflecting the growing resilience of the Allied system. Strategically, the campaign became harder to interrupt. Progress continued at a measured pace, but territory gained was held securely. Coordination replaced improvisation as the defining feature of Allied operations. Speed still contributed to success, but it no longer threatened to outrun the system that sustained it. What followed when Patton's orders outpaced Eisenhower's strategy was not punishment or retreat. It was correction. Eisenhower ensured that momentum served strategic purpose rather than undermining it. By doing so, he preserved both operational effectiveness and coalition cohesion, as the war moved toward its conclusion. This episode matters because it reveals a distinction that only becomes visible late in a successful campaign. Orders win battles. Strategy wins wars. When Patton's orders began to outpace Eisenhower's strategy, the issue was not ambition or competence, but scale. Tactical brilliance had expanded faster than the system designed to sustain it. Patton's approach had proven its value when uncertainty dominated the battlefield. Speed denied the enemy coherence. Initiative replaced planning that no longer fit collapsing conditions. In that phase of the war, rapid orders were not merely effective, they were necessary. But as the Allied advance matured, the consequences of those orders extended far beyond the front line. Eisenhower understood that success carried obligations as well as opportunity. Every rapid advance altered supply demands, coalition balance, and political legitimacy. Strategy could no longer react to orders after the fact. It had to govern them in advance. This was not a rejection of aggression, but its integration into a larger purpose. Historically, this moment illustrates why coalition command requires restraint even in victory. Individual initiative, left unchecked, can generate momentum that overwhelms coordination. Eisenhower's leadership lay in recognizing when that threshold had been crossed and acting before imbalance produced crisis. Patton continued to shape the battlefield through pressure and speed. Eisenhower shaped what that pressure meant beyond it. One drove movement forward. The other ensured that movement remained aligned with endurance, unity, and authority. What followed when orders outpaced strategy was not failure, but correction. The Allied advance did not lose momentum. It gained stability. Victory was carried forward not by abandoning speed, but by placing it within a framework capable of absorbing its effects. In the final phase of the war, this balance proved decisive. The Allies advanced not as a collection of competing tempos, but as a coordinated force guided by intent. Eisenhower's decision ensured that when the war ended, it did so under conditions shaped by control rather than chance. That is why this moment endures, not as a clash of personalities, but as a lesson in how command must evolve as success accumulates.